Thank you very much, Madam President, and all the good people who are present in this assembly. It is curious that I should be asked to speak to such a gathering of scientists who are distinguished in the area of agriculture. But yet there is a sense in which every person in Africa ought to have an interest in agriculture, and I do. And only last night, when I was thinking about what to say at this conference, I thought about two things. One, which is a presentation that was made by Kenya's Ali Mazrui several years ago, Africa, the Triple Heritage. And since Ali Mazrui traveled in different parts of Africa, talking about different things, nobody has done a documentary of that nature. And in one of the segments in that presentation, there is one statement that stands out from Ali Mazrui, that Africa produces what it does not consume and consumes what it does not produce. The other thing that came to my mind was from some of the writings and conversations that I've had in the recent past about the early years of Africa, particularly the early thoughts of Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, as early as the year 1957, stretching way up to 1970, until on his deathbed in Bucharest, Romania in 1972. The clarity with which Kwame Nkrumah articulated issues relating to agriculture is something that I found quite relevant. Indeed, one of the things that stands out, even in those early days, was his belief that apart from attaining political independence, true liberation would only be realized by Africa if Africa could feed herself. And those who write about him recognize that one of his early obsessions was the greening of the Sahara Desert, even in those early days. And if you look at some of the activities that he initiated in those early days, the imagination to create a university that would focus on agriculture and technology, it was in many ways an appreciation of the fact that Africa could only realize her potential if she could feed her people. And after the attainment of political independence by many countries in Africa, the realization that Africa had a single backbone as agriculture is one that was not lost on all the leaders of the day. In fact, if you take time and read some of the thoughts of the early political leaders of the day in Africa, agriculture was always given her pride of place. Which begs the question, why is it that over 50 years after independence, Africa cannot feed herself? And one need not go through all the countries, but one is starkly reminded that even as we speak today, there are muted talks about drought and therefore the inability of the Ethiopians to feed themselves. There is talk about the South Sudanese inability to feed themselves. The Central African Republicans cannot feed themselves. The Nigerians make do without tomatoes, which they love so very much, because they cannot produce enough. We in this country cannot produce enough maize. The Malawians, whom we celebrated several years ago, are now grappling with drought. And the Angolans will have the same story as will the Mozambicans, begging the question, why is it that we appear to diagnose the disease of Africa, and yet when we apply a new antidote, a new wound appears? These are questions that I believe worry you who are in this field on a daily basis. You who are constantly engaging with new ideas and asking yourself the difficult questions. If you allow me a little room for maneuver, I will remember nostalgically my much younger days in my rural village, when the levels of nutrition, in my view, was a lot better on average than it is today. People could walk to the lake and buy fish, so they took care of their protein in those days. People could till their kitchen gardens, and in many ways they could satisfy their domestic needs. People could till their land without the use of fertilizer, and in many ways they could get yields that would satisfy them and something to take to the market to cater for their other needs. But on average today, if you visit many rural African villages, whether those villages are in Eritrea or in Tanzania or in Kenya or in Chad or the Democratic Republic of Congo, there is a sense in which we have become prisoners of a new way of doing things. Every evening, little children are dispatched to the nearest shopping center to buy highly sifted maize meals. And that is what they make do, making an all-starch meal. Begging the question once again, why is it that so many years after the attainment of political independence, why is it that after so many years with universities that we have created in almost all countries dedicated to agriculture, we have not been able to conquer this problem of greening Africa and making Africa self-sufficient in the area of production of food, and specifically grain. I oftentimes, in my more unguarded and uncharitable moments, indict Africa, that why is it that 50 years after independence on average, without being an opponent of globalization, why is it that it's still Monsanto and Syngenta that must produce maize seed for us? Why is it that over so many years, while being alive to the presence of Kenya Seed and Seedco, why is it that this has not been replicated in different parts of Africa? Why must we still swear by Monsanto and Syngenta as the standard gold in that area? Why is it that those of you who have had the advantage of exposure to innovation in the area of agriculture, why is it that your intervention has not made dramatic changes? And one is not simply saying that nothing has been done. One is asking the uncomfortable question, why Africa continues to punch below her weight in the area of agriculture, if we are to be specific. Why is it, one asks, that Africa does not produce enough wheat to feed her people, while our people love bread? Why is it that Africa does not produce enough sugar cane to satisfy her needs? Why is it that Africa does not produce enough maize enough sorghum, enough millet, enough barley, enough of everything to be a continent that can sit at the dinner table of human civilization and say unequivocally, we are capable of feeding ourselves. This is the conversation that I believe one must engage in. And we who have the advantage of being present in this assembly must go back and ask ourselves certain very basic questions. I remember in the 1960s, courtesy of history, when many African countries had attained political independence, the leaders of the day were quite clear in their first-year development, 5-year development plans. If you read the development plan of any country, whether it was Tanzania or Uganda or Ghana or Nigeria or Sierra Leone or Senegal, agriculture always had a pride of place jointly with education as the areas that received the lion's share of budgetary allocation. One also saw in those early days that institutions of higher learning, both at the degree level and at the level of certificate and diploma, were given focus because it was realized by the leaders and the bureaucrats of the day that if the continent were to realize the potential, then there was need to give some focus in these areas. Land tenure systems were examined because it was assumed that sometimes the land tenure system that did not allow people to control land militated against the utilization of that land in a manner that would be productive. So that while in many countries there were different land tenure systems, if you went to Uganda, there was a competition between the modern land tenure systems, the freehold, the leasehold, and the traditional ownership. If you went to Zambia, you would find a mix of those tenure systems as you would in Ghana and indeed in Nigeria. But the idea was always, what do we do with our tenure systems to release land for agriculture? And in those early days in the 1960s, Tanzania stood out in many ways because of the ujamaa. Articulated in a very simple form, Mwalimu Nyerere took the view that one of the ways in which you could productively enhance the utilization of land was to congregate population around areas in the nature of mini urbanized areas so that you could release land for mechanized agriculture. The improvement of seed, these were things that occupied center stage. Of course, many of these initiatives, some of which could be described as experimental, did not realize their full potential and has left this area unfulfilled in many ways. But in many ways, Africa still wanted to rely on you. Africa went into the area of producing young men and women who would be trained appropriately, because one of the things that was assumed that there were not enough men and women who had been trained in a manner that would ensure that they could contribute productively and creatively and innovatively to ensure that agriculture was practiced in a positive manner. The question then that we must ask ourselves, we who are in AGRA, and I'm happy that there is an organization known as NEPAD. There is somebody from NEPAD, and the gentleman from NEPAD will excuse me because I'm going to say something that is not very friendly, but it's not from me. Several years ago, when NEPAD came into being, the president of Gambia, called Yahya Jammeh, with whom I do not agree, said that NEPAD is nothing but NEPADs. That Africans were upon their knees as they kneel and beg before other civilizations. Of course, it was a lack of understanding of what NEPAD was created to do. We know that initiatives such as yours were designed to help in the area of helping Africa in different sectors to ensure that she realizes her potential. Another organization that I'm aware is here are representations of the African Union. The African Union is the premier African organization that ought to be providing leadership in the area of agriculture. And it cannot be denied that that particular organization has tried to use our leverage over the years with a view to ensuring that Africa realizes our potential. But the question that we must ask ourselves is this: is the African man and woman in rural Kenya aware of the African Union? Or the African Union may very well be a jamboree of privileged Africans engaged in activities which leave the soul and heart of Africa untouched and unmoved. And one must now focus on AGRA. AGRA is an organization whose stated agenda is the green revolution of Africa. The question is, after AGRA has tried to intervene and had a presence in over 20 countries in Africa, the question that we must ask is whether your typical average African is aware of AGRA's intervention. Is the farmer in rural Tanzania aware of your presence? Is the farmer in rural Malawi aware of your presence? Is the farmer in southern Sudan aware of your presence? In other words, is your presence being felt? Or you are merely yet another organization in a continent that is littered with organizations which claim to be doing things which leave the continent unmoved and untouched? These are questions that we must ask ourselves, particularly now in the history of Africa. Because sometimes, without being a Jewish prophet, I look to the future and ask myself, what will happen to Africa in 20 years from today? Africa has one of the youngest populations. Land in Africa is reducing by the day. Many African countries are not using their land optimally. If you examine many African countries, and allow me to just examine a few of them and ask ourselves the critical question, what it is that is happening in those countries. Today, Nigeria claims, and I underline the word claims, that is the largest economy in Africa, with a GDP of about 550 billion United States dollars, with possibly a population of about 200 million. They have never had a census in the recent past. If they have had one, nobody believes it. And there is every possibility that the population of Nigeria in 2050 will be about 1 billion of them. Nigeria relies on oil. 80% of its income is from oil production. It suffers from what commentators describe as the Dutch disease. Nigeria is incapable of producing enough rice for her people, but they love jollof rice. They are incapable of producing enough chili, and they love their chili. They are incapable of producing enough tomatoes, and they love their tomatoes. They are incapable of doing things, not because they do not have the ability, but a conscious decision has been made by people at critical positions to concentrate on oil as the milk cow for Nigeria. So going forward, what one must ask, particularly an organization such as AGRA and NEPAD and the African Union, what real interventions must be made in Nigeria? Because Nigeria is a true potential giant in that regard. If Nigeria were to wake up from her slumber, then the entire West African region would wake up from her slumber. Because one has analyzed Nigeria and the plight of Nigeria and our inability as we speak now to produce enough food for ourselves, one need not analyze Mali. One need not analyze Senegal. One need not analyze the little Benin and the little Togo and the little Gabon and the little Cameroon, because the story is the same in that part of the world. Those of you who have gone to that part of the world, getting milk in the shelves of the stores in those countries is as difficult as getting snow in hell. So there is a sense in which we must ask ourselves the critical question: why is it that those interventions don't make us realize our potential? One sometimes, as one looks to the future and one looks at Congo, a country that is as big as the entire Western Europe, and yet Congo, with a population of no more than 80 million, yet Congo, whose perhaps 90% of our land is arable, one asks the question, if that land were to be utilized productively, that land could feed the entire Africa. In fact, I remember now it being said of Congo that it is capable of doing three things which could liberate Africa. That Congo is capable of generating enough hydroelectric power to cover the entire Africa. That Congo has waters in her rivers that could irrigate the entire Sahara Desert. Of course, some of it is exaggerated, but is exaggerated deliberately to demonstrate to us the levels of underutilization of that potential. That the Congolese soil is capable of producing enough food for the entire Africa. One asks the question, what must one do in order to unlock the potential of the Democratic Republic of Congo? One asks the same question of Angola. If Angola were to use her land effectively and liberate herself from the chains of dependency on oil, what could Angola achieve? You will remember not so long ago, during the first term of President Mbingu wa Mutharika in Malawi, that one of the songs of praises that were composed in his honor was that he found a country called Malawi that could not feed herself, and within 5 years the country was feeding herself and exporting enough grain. We now know that that is not the case as we speak. But the question that one is focusing on is, what is it therefore that you who are latter-day missionaries from AGRA, what is it that you must do? What is it? What are the kind of intervention that you must engage in? One can say that countries need to look at their budget reallocations. That is a good point of intervention, so that there is consciousness at the political level that Africa can only realize her potential if she has enough money dedicated to the improvement of agriculture. I do not know whether in your countries in Africa, in certain areas, they still farm in the manner that is so very well described in the Bible, where very late into the period that is set for planting, the farmer discovers that it's too late to till the land, and they take some bullocks and go into some open field. And as the bullocks run through the plow, they spray the seed, forlornly hoping that some will fall in the soil and that ultimately they'll have a bumper harvest. Does that remind you sometimes of your rural village? That still happens in Africa. despite the fact that certain governments have budgetary allocations complete with agricultural extension officers with whom you engage in your daily lives. But these agricultural extension officers are engaged not in agricultural extension, but extensions of their field visit for the sake of extending their per diems. These are issues that we must ask ourselves, so that there is governmental intervention in terms of budgetary allocation. We must also ask ourselves, what about the training that we are offering our students in different parts of the country in universities? I remember in the early days when in this country we had only one university, there was a dedicated institution at Egerton which was dedicated for agriculture. And I remember in those early days, the young men and women who were trained in that institution were exported to different parts of Africa, and they served and served well. But I remember now that those institutions no longer offer agriculture. They offer other courses, including conflict resolution. There is nothing wrong with conflict resolution. But I hold the view that we should be producing more agriculture graduates rather than more conflict resolvers and archaeologists. And there is nothing wrong with archaeology and history. But there is something important about equipping our young men and women with the ability to produce food, because food is at the very heart of human development in terms of the food chain of courses that ought to be offered in different institutions of learning. The other thing that we must ask ourselves is the attitude of the men and women. And once again, this reminds me of a speech that was given in 1966 by Tanzania's president about agriculture. And this is what he said, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, that what amazes him about his own country, Tanzania, is that 99% of Tanzanians claim that they are farmers. But 99% cannot feed more than 50%. But he said that in other parts of the world, and he gave an example of the United States of America, whether the statistics were wrong or right is another debate. He was making this point in order to, giving this example in order to make his point. He said, in the United States of America, perhaps no more than 1% claim that they are farmers, but the 1% is capable of feeding the entire population with enough to export. He said, he then asked the rhetorical question, what is it that we are doing wrong? And that is the question that perhaps I should be posing at this conference, at this assembly. What is it that we do not do right? And this is a very personal question, which each one of us who are in the sector and the area of agriculture must pose to ourselves and answer for ourselves. If indeed, before you were born, Monsanto had been established, and if indeed Monsanto over the years has been trailing the blaze in terms of offering seeds of high quality, if indeed before you went to the university, Syngenta was alive and well, and they have been doing this over the years, the question that we must ask ourselves and must be asked of the 20-odd countries in which AGRA is alive and well, why is it that the knowledge that is resident in Monsanto has not been meaningfully transferred in institutions in those countries? Why is it that the umbilical cord remains firm, alive and well and uncut even when the baby is ex utero? Why is it? This is the question that we must pose. Why is it that in the area of husbandry, in terms of fertilizer, Africa still looks for fertilizer outside of the continent? I was telling my good friend here that there are two things that every civilization should always have control over if it is to be a civilization that will live for a long time: the production of food and the production of medicine. That you cannot leave these to others to do for you, because those are, in a manner of speaking, the building blocks of civilization. If you go to countries in Europe and you remember and remind yourselves of your own history, you'll remember that Europe had to undergo what was described as an agrarian revolution. I'm submitting to you that Africa has never known agrarian revolution. I'm submitting to you that the role of AGRA is to introduce true agrarian revolution in Africa, because it is only when there is a true agrarian revolution in Africa that Africa will be able to realize a potential in the other areas. Some of you who are familiar with agrarian revolution and the indices of agrarian revolution may not agree with me. But I'm submitting that if you only have pockets of change in a sea of a continent that does not change, then that is not change. I remember not so long ago when the millennium came about, a good American professor came to Kenya, amongst other countries, and founded things that were described as millennium villages. It was assumed then that that was the magic bullet, that after the millennium villages had been introduced, Africa would never be the same again. And I remember visiting such a village somewhere in rural Nyanza at a place called Barsauri in Game in Siaya County. And I remember the man taking us around in the Millennium Village. And I remember the man telling us how life would never be the same again. And I remember marveling about the Millennium Village. And I remember saying to myself, lo and behold, a miracle has happened. Last year when I visited the Millennium Village, it was a shell of what it was. The reason why it is a shell is because that intervention did not find residence in the minds and hearts, and therefore did not change the culture of the people. It was a solution that was from outside and was never internalized. I'm submitting to you, therefore, that in trying to green Africa, in trying to create a green revolution, in trying to ensure that Africa changes, we must ask ourselves, what is the kind of change that we introduce? We must ask ourselves whether the culture has changed so that people are wedded to the new way of doing things. Many times, changes do not take place because that intervention is seen as being alien to the environment, as being alien to the people, and therefore when those who have introduced the change, or those who are seen to have introduced the change, have exited the scene, people go back into their default mode and they go back to their old ways. And that is what begs the question, what is the role of AGRA? Not so long ago, I was at a conference where people were talking about population of Africa and birth control. And the story was told of a young girl who had gone to an area in Kitui in Kenya. And this young girl was alone. And she was talking to young brides, on average with 2 children, talking to them about the finer points of family planning. And after she had finished, one of the women asked, "And how many children do you yourself have?" And the young girl said, I have none. One of the women said, you are therefore unqualified to talk about family planning. I do not quite hold that view. I do hold the view that sometimes seeing things from outside gives you certain insights, which those who are inside may never have. But yet I hold yet another view, that there is wisdom in having gone through personal experience, so that the experience, the theoretical experience of the young maiden who has never had a child must be complemented with the experience of those who have had actual experience. And that is why I think that those of you who are in AGRA must ask yourself the fundamental question, why are you at AGRA? Why are you at AGRA? What is it that you want to be remembered for at AGRA? What are the changes that you want to make at AGRA? And these are very basic questions. What is it that motivates you? What is it that you want to do to ensure that AGRA changes the face of Africa? Because Africa is a continent that has now made a declaration that in the year 2063, under Agenda 2063, she is going to be a middle-level economy. Africa has made that declaration. And Africa must therefore ask the fundamental question, what are the building blocks that will ensure that she realizes that agenda? Those of you who are from the African Union, I want to believe that agriculture must be at the very heart of it, because Africa can only realize Agenda 2063 if Africa can feed herself. You who are here, what are you doing to ensure that that dream is realized? In the 1980s, if you heard that somebody was traveling to Harare in Zimbabwe, there are two things that you asked when they came back. One, you asked them to bring back. The two others, you asked them to tell you what was happening about them. The thing that you asked them to bring back was a cotton shirt. They had very good shirts. The other thing that you asked them about was the quality of their farms, tobacco and agriculture. Today, when you come from Zimbabwe, with due respect to the Zimbabweans who are in the room, the only thing you ask, which is the currency that is now alive and well? Is it the rand, the dollar, or the yuan? And I give that example deliberately in order to demonstrate the fact that intervention in areas such as agriculture must also be accompanied by a political system that appreciates people's expertise. It is not the mere possession of the land that is the solver of the equation. The same farmers, some of them who are in Zimbabwe, have now gone to Zambia and to Nigeria, and they are replicating the very same things that they were doing in Zimbabwe. And the land left to the individuals who thought that land was the solver of the problem cannot produce. It is still in Zimbabwe. The land is in situ where it was. So the intervention must also be the kind of intervention that makes people realize that the knowledge must be resident in people's minds and expertise must be locally nurtured so that people are capable of using that expertise for the general good. The other thing that I think is important is to begin to educate the people, because I know you are concerned with smallholders in agriculture, but we must never forget that the game-changing agriculture must also be large-scale farming. We must ask ourselves, what are we doing with the irrigation projects that we find in different parts of Africa, in Kenya, whether it is in Egypt and different parts of the world? One must not lose sight of that. And one must ask, what are the inputs that we are utilizing in order to ensure that Africa actually realizes our potential? In a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, one can go on and on about AGRA. One can go on and on about agriculture, but one must now wind down in order to ask certain fundamental questions. And to me, there are 10 questions that we must put on the table in order to ensure that AGRA realizes her potential. Question number 1, which is the foundational question, is what is the reason why AGRA was created? Why did we create AGRA at all? And my understanding is that this organization exists for, among other things, for the sensitization of populations in a positive manner, that they can use the resource known as land to liberate themselves from the chains of poverty. Question number 2, which is equally foundational. What kind of interventions must AGRA make which are sensitive to the realities of the organization and sensitive to the realities of the people that they intervene with? And my understanding is that AGRA exists for, among other things, intervening in a manner that is sensitive to the cultural realities of the societies in which they intervene, and in a manner that is capable of addressing the economic needs and agenda of the country in which they are intervening. Question number 3 is, how does AGRA intervene? Because the manner in which you intervene is critical to the acceptance of the agenda that you are injecting into the environment. Because there is a sense in which there must be a time when the child which has been adopted must be released so that they are able to go, so that AGRA is capable of saying, behold, we found a child that was incapable of walking, but behold, because of our intervention, it can now walk. Number 5, what are the methods that you are using, and are they sustainable after your departure? In other words, are you entering into the arena with tools of engagement, which tools can be embraced, which tools can be understood, which tools, when deployed, are capable of being utilized in a manner that will be possible even after your departure? Question number 6 that we must have: with what agenda are you leaving? In other words, with what agenda are you entering the process? Are you entering the process with a view to ensuring that the economic health of that particular community is aided? And if you are going to do so, is it visible to that community, and are they capable of appreciating that your entry will make their lives better? And question number 7, once you have entered into the agenda, what engagements do you have with the local expertise that are present on the ground, so that they feel that they are part of the equation, and that once you leave, there are linkages which are there as a point of reference if need arises? And question number 8 that must be asked: what linkages are you creating for the people that you have intervened on their behalf, to ensure that if they produce their markets, because Africa sometimes produces things that it cannot sell? And question number 9, what interventions are you making to ensure that the externalities which may undermine the communities are mitigated, so that these communities are therefore protected from the dangers that may visit them? And lastly, the question that you who are present there are so wedded to the process that the people can see that your zeal and zest and vim and verve at once are transported to them, and that you own the processes as if they were your own. In my view, I believe that if those 10 things occupy the space which informs your engagement, then AGRA will be doing a good job. And very lastly, to NEPAD and to the African Union African Union and NEPAD are useful institutions. What linkages do you have with organizations such as AGRA? What components of your budget find their way to AGRA, so that ultimately AGRA can be an organization that feeds from the breast of Africa? This is the question that African Union must ask. This is the question that NEPAD must ask. And if you ask these questions and answer them boldly, I have no doubt in my mind, African Union, that Africa will realize her Agenda 2063. Permit me to stop there. Thank you.
So, Professor, I want to ask, if you have so much traverse in the governance process, all right, on which agriculture also depends, what do we do? Okay, because today you introduce few things that you think will make a change. Now, new sets of people come, they have different agenda, all right, and sustainability is crucial for what we are doing. So how do we move in that regards? Thank you.
One of the key elements of this is, that governments don't feed their countries. Countries are fed by networks of agribusinesses who intervene to serve seeds and fertilizers and buy the harvest from farmers. It's really, agriculture is a business. And to that extent, we have worked extremely hard to build a series of African Monsantos and Syngentas. And let me assure you, there are some brilliant entrepreneurs out there who are busy building those companies today, thanks to the intervention of AGRA. We have invested in over 110 African seed companies, and we are confident that some of them will grow into regional giants with time. But what the problem we run into is when we go to governments and we say, these are the companies that will feed your people, they don't really believe that. They see it as really perhaps their job. And some of them who see the successes of these companies sometimes rise up or deviate off and try to thwart the growth of these companies. So my question to you is, what do we do about that? How do we convince Africa's governments that what they really need to do to feed their people is get behind the agribusiness sector that they can see now starting to grow some roots in their borders?
I'm wondering if you have ever asked yourself how many head of states have been able to listen to you or to follow what you've been preaching so far. I'm asking the question because the governance issue is really a challenge, whether we're talking about the health sector, agriculture, or education. It seems to me that listening to you may at some point inform to the large extent how the head of states could look at themselves inward in making sure that they do the right thing. I'm wondering if you have a network or a pathway to reach out to them, or you are just, people come to you for advice, or you offer your services. Because for our countries, in some of them like Cameroon or Zimbabwe, not to mention them, having been through what we call failed governance system for the last 30 years plus, I think it's a really big issue. We don't see the end of the tunnel anywhere near. Thank you.
One question concerning the legal foundations of a capitalist economy that we are trying to put in place in order to undergird and support the work that AGRA is doing. In most cases, in some of these countries, simple acts or regulations that allow seed companies to access fertilizer, to access breeder seed and so forth are not in place, or they are flawed. And when you try to do something to put them in place, you're told the Parliamentary Agricultural Committee members, they need certain payment in order to pass laws and or to advocate for certain laws in Parliament. Can you
will say something about it?
We often ask ourselves these same questions you've been asking us for the last 1 hour. But in many cases, a lot of people think agriculture as a technology problem. It's about seeds, it's about fertilizer, it's about improved agronomic practices. And we all know these technologies work. We all know what the problems are. We know what the solutions are. The difficulty we have in Africa is actually delivering these known technologies to the farmer so that the farmer internalizes them. But often the challenge we see is about, as my colleague said, in government policies, in putting the right institutions, the legal framework. And also, most of our leadership is engaged in a good part of our continent in self-enrichment. Even if we have basically
go to the question,
democracy as a 5-year election instead of really being accountable to the people. So how can we really create a system where governments, in Asia we have seen countries under dictatorship, but these were benevolent dictators which put the needs of their people and their countries first, and they have brought hundreds of millions of people in about 2-3 decades. So what should we do really in Africa?
Do you agree with the myth that says, which I partly believe in, that probably independence should have waited? We should have had colonization 50 years after to take advantage of the infrastructure and build the moral fiber to be able to manage and administer what is left behind.
Are you actually saying that the moral fiber was being imported? I find that ridiculous. So,
how are you equipping the students at the Kenya School of Law to go beyond legal jargon, legal expertise, legal drafting, to actually address the problems within the society so that they offer drafting that is actually solutions oriented, so that when we have the parliamentarians debating the different bills, they actually have proper, bills to work with, because the drafters are most of the time lawyers and they usually have come through your hands.
Now, I come from a region where there is a saying, there are two. One is, a fish always rottens from the head.
Really?
What went wrong? Second, a caravan always goes at the speed of the slowest camel. Assuming that we know where to go, where is the smallest camel? I think AGRA is part of that solution, of rebuilding a belief in the smallholder farming, in ourselves to feed ourselves, a self-confidence in our communities, a belief in science, and making sure that it is sustainable because we invest in local private sector. How do we put this caravan on the right track? By combining wisdom, knowledge, and the numbers to get to the promised land. I think this is what we're talking about.
We have to go to defensive. Everyone, when you want to assess yourself, you always think that you are doing the good thing. You can sit as AGRA here and say, we are doing the good thing. When you are at African Union, you think, oh, we are really doing the good thing. The same with NEPAD. But when you hear about what he's saying, I think there is something wrong as he's saying. Because we're not, irrespective of this declaration that our president have made, our heads of state, we want to achieve Malabo Declaration by 2025, Agenda 2063, but the pace we are achieving those declarations is really slow. Then brings these 10 questions that he's asking. I will not ask, let's say, a technical question, because here we are technicians. I don't think he can come and give us all the response of these technical questions that we are asking here. But I think we can ask him at least before we make a grant at AGRA. Can we have this kind of question that Professor is asking, so that we check that where we want to go is in line with this vision that he's actually highlighting here. This is just to ask him if he can write something that can inspire our way of doing business. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will not pretend to be answering the questions. What I'll do is simply, very briefly, to share my thoughts on some of the issues that have been raised, and you don't have to agree with me at all. Let me, not in any order, but I think there is a sense in which the African problem, and I'll start with your myth. I don't agree that independence ought to have been delayed. Because, and with due respect to Zimbabwe, for example, Zimbabwe's independence was delayed. And one of the things that we marveled about, and which you still marvel about in Harare, is the quality of your roads. There is a sense in which the right policies are at the very heart. That is not to say that the land question in Zimbabwe is not an issue. It is. And many Zimbabweans will remember in the first 10 years of President Mugabe's tenure, he was the recipient of an award, together with Ghana's Olowo, as having been at the heart of proper management of the country. Which means, if the Zimbabweans here will remember, it was an international award given to President Mugabe and Olowo of Ghana. And one of the areas that was focused on in giving him that award was agriculture, because Zimbabwe was truly the bread basket of that part of the world. So that, I think, combining with the question that you've asked about what we teach at our institutions, and this is becoming very true. If you look at many African countries, in the early days there was the realization that expertise was critical. So that institutions, if you went to Tanzania, you had institutions that focused on agriculture and technology. In Zambia and in many of these countries, and the laws were informed by policy, law, and then implementation. That hierarchy, that you had to have a policy position. And many countries had these. Of course, we think that they are now new. Now that we talk of vision, we do not know that, in fact, in the first 5 years of our independence, each country was driven by some vision and some policy, and that law was distilled from those policy and strategic positions. We've now become so tactical in our solution to things that we've forgotten that there is a strategic agenda. We have tactical positions, which, as you know, you who are experts here, you've got to have a strategic direction. You may change your tactics, but the strategy, the overarching strategy, remains undisturbed. And this is what calls into question the whole question of governance in Africa. And governance must be understood at different levels. You talk about the political governance, which informs governance in the sector, in the different sectors. In agriculture, if you look at Kenya, for example, we have all these laws that have been made to deal with the coffee sector, with the tea sector, with the sugar sector. And then, of course, recently we also have these regional protocols. In East African Community, we have them. In SADC, you have them. Then in ECOWAS, you have them. In Central Africa, you have them. And lack of harmony in some of these things. And part of it, of course, is not just disharmony in Africa, but through bilateral and multilateral treaties. So Africa must also have a clarity of some of the things that we get into. You, as East Africa, you have a position. Let me take, for example, the position that Kenya has adopted about GMOs. We have a country position on this. What is the East African position on this? Is there a uniform understanding of it? And I think these are the things that we must talk about now that we have agreed that we are moving block by block East African community. I was talking to some East African parliamentarians, and I was telling them that, you see, if we want to move as East Africa on the critical issues that define Africa and define us, we must have one common position. that defines how we engage with others. So that once East Africa has entered into this position, if it is in the area of agriculture, then we have one common position that we used to deal with the Chinese. Just to veer off a little, we are now importing fish from China. What is the position? What is the East African position? Kenya is doing it. Does Uganda think it is right? Does Rwanda think it is right? Burundi, South Sudan? So lack of clarity. And I said, to the anger of my audience at one time, and I was rather uncharitable, that the problem with Africa is that those who have ideas have no power, and those with power have no ideas. and that in many ways still informs. So you have all these ideas on how we can green Africa. I listen to you and I can see you are bubbling with ideas, but you don't have the power. And the fellow with power has completely no ideas. And yet somehow, and this I think is your problem, when the electorate is given the choice between you with ideas and the one without ideas, the Africans' affinity for people without ideas is amazing. It's amazing. And just to give you an idea of how, and permit me to give the credit to your President Paul Kagame, that you can see that there are certain areas in sector, if you go to the livestock sector, for example, the intervention of the Rwandese government is sensitive to the realities of the Rwandese household. And they may have their problems, and problems will always be there, but there is a sense in which if you ask an average Rwandese whether the government has got it right, they'll say they have it right, which is a good thing. If you look at our government, Kenyan government position on coffee, and you ask your typical coffee grower or tea grower whether our government has got it right, they tell you they don't have an idea. And that is why they are uprooting coffee. So there is a sense in which the government's involvement is quite clear. And that is how I understand the Cameroonian problem with President Biya. There is a sense in which there's... I don't know how to be polite about this. I'm trying to look for a word about there is a sense in which the ideas get frozen. You get people in government so that governmental positions are given because people are rewarded rather than people with passion. If you look at the early movement in Africa, the first 5 years in many African countries, the men and women who were given positions in government had some zeal of a missionary kind. If they were in agriculture, there is a sense in which you could see the drive, my people must be liberated from hunger. If you see the education, if you see health, and in some countries it is in fact the institutions and structures which were built in that era that are still alive and well, including the legal infrastructure. But unfortunately that disappeared. And how do we repair it? I think that there is a sense in which an institution such as the African Union can do it. And why I say African Union can do it is that African Union can do it because it is a continental body with a larger agenda. And I hope now that with the proposal African Union has made about, is it some tax that you want, is it a proposal, is that tax? Because part of your problem is that you have many ideas, but you have no funds. Because if you have an idea and then you depend on a Western NGO to fund your agenda, they are not interested. They do what is in their best interest, and I don't quarrel with them. He who pays the piper must necessarily call the tune. So the day Africa begins to deploy her own resources and understand that agriculture is at the very heart of it, we must ask ourselves, for example, and my good friend from Nigeria must ask, if you go to your typical West African breakfast table, butter will be from Denmark. Skimmed milk will be from Switzerland. Possibly eggs from Romania or from the United Kingdom. Ketchup from the United States. Chilies from Portugal. So that effectively you can see, and you talked about agribusiness. if we could ensure that there are these linkages in markets so that the farmer, right now I belong to some group and I see somebody say, I had a lot of mangoes, but the mangoes are rotten. So that there are those who have there is a surplus of an item, yet there is a shortage of it in one area. And I think that this is something that must be done, and I think the African Union can achieve it. So linkages between AGRA and African Union and ECOWAS and SADC and EAC cannot indeed be underrated. And of course, the question that was asked from Ethiopia, there is this argument that is now alive and well, whether Africa does not need benevolent dictators. And there is argument that is normally put forth, they cite Lee Kuan Yew and little Singapore, which is a city-state, and I told them that there is a sense in which the ideas are good, but the solution of Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore will not quite work in Democratic Republic of Congo. But there are ideas that can be borrowed. But I still believe that a democratic dispensation is capable of delivering these things. And once again, one looks at Ethiopia. Ethiopia, a population of nearly 90 million, slowly releasing its... And I think that the Ethiopian model, if it continues at the pace at which it is continuing, there is a sense in which Ethiopia, in the next 30 years, may be a country to look at. Releasing the political space slowly, because you don't want to confront us with some of these ideas too quickly, like I find ourselves confronted in Kenya and other countries. Slowly. And slowly working on the land tenure systems. I was telling him, in my rural village, somebody who is working on a swamp asked the local community to give one block of 100 acres of land, and there was none to be found, because after every 10 meters there is a grave. And in my culture, you can't just come and plow down this grave, because the departed will visit pain upon you. So you can see that sometimes dealing with these issues is not as easy. You have fellows, you start off, your father left you with 10 acres of land. You have 5 brothers. 10 years down the line, it is now divided into 2 acres. You have each 3 sons, and now daughters are also included. By the time you are finished with dividing this land, each one of us now has a piece of land of this kind of acreage, just a small space like this. And you must agree with me that that also militates against the intervention that you are making. And there are areas in which, like Kenya, what percentage of land is arable in Kenya? Very small percentage of land is arable. And the Sahara Desert is not shy about moving down south. So there is a sense in which all these things must also be looked at in the context of land tenure systems. And this is something that I know we are not confronting, and you confront it on the ground. So as I conclude, there is a sense in which technology is a problem. In fact, Nyerere had it right. He got it. He realized very early on, how do we do it? We do it by putting together. Right now, our government, for example, says that electricity, there is 60% penetration. In my rural home, there is one transformer. It serves only 2 families, because one family is there, another one is there, so that you have this penetration, but is fiction of penetration. The truth is that that one transformer, if you had settlement, it would serve possibly 20 households. It would release land, and it would ensure that indeed you can have some of these things done in a manner that is friendly to technology. And lastly, we must also consider, I remember, and some of you will remember, in very many households in rural Africa, there was a kitchen garden. It may not have been called a kitchen garden, but there was something where there was always a banana plantation. There was always some tradition of vegetables. Once you'd washed your utensils, you'll pour water into it. It is irrigation by accident, but irrigation nevertheless. All these things have to be brought to bear. And one must conclude by saying that one is simply giving the ideas, but I think that the game changer in Africa at the critical level is at the level of the fish not rotting at the head. I think that is fundamentally the problem, that all these beautiful ideas that are being generated, there is no sense of implementation, so that you'll find that individuals in government will actually undermine agriculture because they are the major importers of maize. So they don't want it to succeed. They'll undermine rice production because they are importing rice. But if you look at countries that are beginning to think about their countries, look at countries like Japan, with nothing. They are encouraging the growing of rice in little sacks in people's households. So there are many things, but yet even in the face of all that, I refuse to give up hope. Because I hold the view that this continent can realize our potential. And sometimes you who are present there may think that you are doing nothing. But let me tell you, ask yourself, as one policeman once asked me, when we were in the business of condemning policemen in the 1990s, he says, let us today as policemen announce that we have withdrawn our services for 1 week. It is only then that you would know that our presence contributes to something. Just ask yourself the question, suppose AGRA were to withdraw her services where you are working today. You may think you have a bad situation, but it would be desperate if you left, which means that your intervention is worth something. You may not solve it, and as I grow older, I no longer look for solutions which are dramatic, which will happen in my lifetime. I hold the view that is block by block, that those who plant the tree are different from those who water it. And those who prune the tree are different from those who will ultimately enjoy the shade. It is generational. If you look at it that way, then you will be comfortable in the knowledge that you only play your part, and play it so well that when you go to sleep, you have a decent 5-hour sleep. That is the only way. Thank you.